All who are thirsty, come to the waters, says the Lord. Though you have no money, come and drink with joy. The Lord of hosts is with us. Our stronghold is the God of Jacob. The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. Near restful waters he leads me. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. So this is a different kind of talk from what I've tried to give before. This is mainly personal observations about 3 US presidents built up over 45 years, as Dave Goodell reminded me in his blurb, built up over 45 years of teaching European history. That is to say, in graduate school, I never had a course in US presidents and only a survey courses in US history in general, so I'm not particularly knowledgeable about the subject, except that as you teach modern European history, it's impossible to avoid the United States and therefore impossible to avoid certain US presidents. So I chose the 3 that I talked about the most back when I was teaching, and also what it was that I said about them from the standpoint of a European history. The first exhibit is Woodrow Wilson. Now, occasionally, if I can remember to do this, I'll be referring to Siena College, which is in New York, and many of you have heard of it. And it's more or less regular ratings of US presidents that seem to come out, I don't know, every 5 or 10 years or so, and gets a little bit of publicity. And so they rank them all from 1 down to 45. I think it's interesting to see how the rankings shift a bit. Woodrow Wilson in 1982 was ranked 6, which is pretty high, and I would say too high. Then in 2010, he came down a little bit to 8, and in 2018, he came down to 11, and I think he's getting close to the level where he ought to be. But today, Wilson has become controversial, particularly at Princeton, which he put on the map academically. So I thought I would say a little bit about that first, though it's off my main topic. Wilson is heavily criticized at Princeton for 2 things. One of criticism, I think, is bogus, and that is that as president of Princeton, he presided over an all-male institution. Okay, well, I think that's bogus. Practically every college in America was all male, and there would have been nothing Wilson could have done to introduce women, even if he had wanted to, which he didn't really, I'm sure. But that's the one criticism. The other is, I dare say, more serious, and you just have to decide for yourself how heavily you think this should weigh against him. And that in that he was a segregationist and probably, well, I mean, I think almost certainly a racist, because in America of the early 20th century or 19th century, who wasn't really a racist? There were no blacks admitted to Princeton while Wilson was president, and would not have been. In his defense, so this is a weak defense, while he was president at Princeton, they did admit 1 Jew and 1 Roman Catholic, and that's almost risible, isn't it, to think that this is a great step forward to break down your barriers against Jewish people and Roman Catholics. But that said, when Wilson became president, he actually took steps backward from perhaps a semi-enlightened policies of the preceding Republican administrations. And it was the Republican Party, just to remind you, that fought the Civil War, Democrats to its end. Democrats were in favor of a compromise peace, possibly one that would have left some slavery intact. It was Republicans under President Grant who administered the Reconstruction, and Grant did so fully. And it was Democrats who forced a political deal to abandon Reconstruction. And that remained true for some time. The Democrats were not exactly the party of racial liberation. I grew up in Georgia, as I said a few minutes ago, and that was a one-party state, and the one party was the Democrats, and we were, of course, were heavily segregated. Now that's all changed a lot, but in Wilson's day, that was still the norm for the country to favor segregation and to be racist. And what Wilson did was to relieve a certain black officials, post office people, and perhaps a little higher of offices to which Republican presidents had appointed them. So that's unnecessary. It's embarrassing. It makes us a little bit mad. And if you want to say, well, maybe more than a little bit mad, and if you want to say that that's enough to condemn Wilson and drop him from 11 down to who knows where, 30, 40, whatever, you have every right to that opinion. As an historian, I'm uncomfortable with all the new criteria that have emerged in the last several years for judging any people's statues of presidents, whoever you care to name. Because what we're doing now is implying a new ethical standards of contemporaries to people who have been alive 100 years ago, or maybe even dead 100 years ago. There's nobody who's going to meet severe contemporary criteria, certainly not Wilson. And many of us historians would say it's unhistorical, but others, I think the younger people are all in favor of it. Well, I don't want to get off too much. Be writing a letter to the editor before we know it. Wilson, to review, was born in 1856 in Virginia. Was a Presbyterian, born into a Presbyterian family. His father was the Presbyterian minister there in Staunton, Virginia. Soon after Wilson's birth, they moved to Augusta, Georgia, and after that to Columbia, South Carolina. And so his whole boyhood, youth, early manhood was spent in the South. And I feel pretty sure that's where his racism, pro-segregationism came from. He went to college at Princeton, another Presbyterian school then. I guess we've long since severed contacts with Princeton, denominationally speaking, just as the Methodists have abandoned Duke and Vanderbilt, and for that matter, Baptists have abandoned my college, no longer a small college, Mercer University down in Georgia. Anyway, when Wilson went to Princeton, it was no big deal academically. It was a college that catered to Southern guys, not too academically motivated. A gentleman's kind of college, you might say, nothing special. He graduated in 1879. I assume he was a good student. Took a year or so at the University of Virginia Law School, didn't get a degree. This was not unusual at the time. Practiced law in Atlanta briefly. I'm afraid I didn't know him then, but didn't like the legal profession, and took himself to Johns Hopkins University, to study a cross between history and political science. I think political scientists used to claim Wilson, and as did historians. I hope they still do. It was significant that he went to Hopkins for a doctoral degree. He got one of the first doctoral degrees in the history of U.S. education. And Hopkins was the first American institution to offer research-oriented doctoral degrees, not only in humanities, but especially in medicine. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, some weeks ago, when I talked about the flu of 1918. In other words, Wilson launched himself on an academic career. He taught briefly at the Bryn Mawr near us and at Wellesley, not too far away, where of all things, I only learned recently, he coached the football team. Never thought of Wilson as any kind of an athlete. And then in 1890, not too long after he graduated Hopkins, came down to Princeton to be a professor. And by all accounts, he was a super college teacher, gifted lecturer, took an interest in his students, was fully committed to the academic profession. It was probably during these years, would have been during the 1890s, that my grandfather met him. Wilson came down to the University of Richmond, where my grandfather was studying, gave some sort of lecture, Unfortunately, grandfather wrote about this in family memoirs that he published 60 years ago. But he said had nothing enlightening to say about Wilson, so I have no insider information there. I'll try to do better when we get to Roosevelt. In 1902, Wilson became president of Princeton. A pretty rapid rise, wouldn't you say? Oh, by the way, I did know someone who knew Wilson at Princeton when he was teaching, and this someone spoke at a conference for graduate students I attended when I was just starting graduate school, and he, the speaker, was deeply enamored of Woodrow Wilson as a teacher, as an educational leader. He was one of the younger faculty whom Wilson hired. We'll get to that in a moment, and I just thought the world of him. Anyway, Wilson, president of Princeton in 1902. Now, here's a story that comes out of legend, which I don't really believe, but it's too good not to be true. As Winston Churchill said once, apropos of some episode or another, it's either all true or it ought to be, and this ought to be. And the story is that Wilson got the job as president because he could use a typewriter, a skill not known to many males at the time. My grandfather learned typing, but he and Wilson were unusual in that generation. And since Wilson could do his own typing, they could release a secretary and save money that way. So you're supposed to chuckle at that. But whether that's true or not, it is true that then being a president of a college was itself, to repeat a phrase, no big deal. And if you wanted to see President Wilson, you just went to one building or another, whichever it was, and strolled down the hall and knocked on his office door. And all he had was a regular office with his typewriter, presumably, in his files. No entourage, no secretaries, no vestibule, no making an appointment. Try that today. And I'm sure that part at least is true. We're talking about Winston Wilson as president of a college because it was he who put Princeton on the map academically. He innovated a host of academic reforms, very creative. He created academic departments, core requirements. He adopted the British method, though he'd never been to England, of using tutors to meet with undergraduates individually or in small groups to interrogate them about reading or topics as opposed to strictly memorizing lectures. And that's where my acquaintance, the speaker of 1960, waxed eloquent about the superiority of this method. Along the way, Wilson began to get some national notice for his reforms and spoke at this or that conference. He was considered a progressive, a word in use today, and that would mean a liberal. These reforms of his at Princeton are progressive type reforms. And he was also a progressive in his politics and hoped to make the Democratic Party, eventually would hope to make the Democratic Party into a party of a similar disposition. In 1910, surprisingly, he was invited by the Board of Trustees to leave Princeton. In other words, he lost his job. But that was, some felt he was going too far, too fast. And he took out after Princeton fraternities, they were called eating clubs, had all the exclusiveness of modern day fraternities. Wilson thought that was undemocratic in terms of education, and they should best be gone. And that did not fly with the alumni, lots of protests. And so there he is, relieved of his jobs, relieved of his duties, a middle-aged man out of work, as I used to say when I lectured in class, a terrible calamity for him personally. What was it? 4 years later, no, 2 years later, he was elected president of the United States. So there's a bounce upwards, you never can tell. In the meantime, he had a term as the governor of New Jersey, progressivist reform governor, Democratic governor of New Jersey. That's how he came to a national attention and began to make a national name for himself. And then in 1912, I expect, by the way, some of you might know better or worse, he was the best governor that New Jersey ever had. But you might say, you could say in Georgia too, that that's meeting a low standard, setting a low standard. In 1912, he declared for president. And in those days, running for president was very different. And so you threw your name in, or maybe you didn't even, but let others people throw it in for you. And Wilson was nominated at the Democratic Convention that summer of 1912. Forget where it met. It might have been Philadelphia, someplace plenty hot. He won the nomination because the other candidates canceled themselves out. But on the 46th ballot in our lifetimes, there's never been such a contentious convention. Got the nomination. And just a second, did you lose me? My computer did something.
No, I have you.
We can hear you, John.
Okay, that's good to know. All right. I guess you'll have to use the telephone if I come off altogether. Let me see if I can do one more thing here.
You're looking good for us, John.
Okay, we'll just let it go then.
We don't see any issue on this end.
All right, glad to know it. Glad to know it. Wilson, normally the Democratic nomination for president wasn't worth having. The presidency was a Republican monopoly. But 1912 was the year that of a split in the Republican Party between Theodore Roosevelt and the incumbent William Howard Taft. So the Republican vote being split, Wilson sailed into the White House and set up shop in his first term as a Democratic reformer, a progressive reformer. He mused, half ironically, when the World War I started 2 years later, that it would be odd that if he ever led the country into war. He had no intention of so doing. Meanwhile, his career as a domestic reformer is something we'll just skip over briefly. He did launch the Democratic Party on the career that it's still on today as the party of progressive reform. His reforms were an 8-hour day, immigration reform, child labor reform, Federal Reserve, antitrust legislation. That was a hot issue in the early 20th century, but one that you'll remember already. If you don't already know it, you'll never forget this. It was Wilson who gave us the federal income tax. And at that point, it was said, don't anybody worry about it. It'll just be for the super rich, for the upper 1%. You know how that worked out. As I said, Wilson was determined not to intervene in World War I in Europe when it broke out in 1914. And most Americans were too. Of course, why would we? That's far away, didn't seem to involve us. A handful of dissidents, but nothing to worry about. Wilson himself was deeply anti-war. He's the most anti-war president that the United States has ever had, or probably ever will have. Well, maybe not. Maybe I can't predict the future. His pacifism, and that's what it was, came from our Civil War. Remember his dates, born in 1856, etc., grew up in the South. He saw the Civil War in a sense. I mean, he saw the wounded veterans coming home, people without arms and legs, grieving families for men who would never come home, the economic dislocation. So if anything, if he was determined on anything, deep in the heart of his Presbyterian soul was the determination to keep the nation out of war. As Lincoln said, but the war came. And just why is take us a little too long, I think, to go into. But unenthusiastically, Wilson recommended to Congress, these were the good old days, when Congress actually exercised its power to declare war. He recommended a declaration of war to Congress. Congress took its time and debated for a week or two and passed the declaration, although by no means unanimously. And so there Wilson was as a wartime president. He was not a hands-on president. He was unlike Lincoln and unlike Franklin Roosevelt. He let making war to the generals and the admirals and to his, particularly his Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, whom we'll come back to. He himself, and this is what it took for the war troubled his conscience deeply. How could he justify it to himself? How could he justify it to the nation? And what he came up with was the idea that the war as he defined it, would be to make a lasting peace so that it would be, and he used this word literally, the war to end wars. It's easy to satirize that expression today, 100 years later, but it meant something then, and it meant a lot to him. I will ask American soldiers and sailors to fight the war, Wilson is saying, but it's for the sake of your progeny, for the sake of future generations. Your sacrifice will guarantee that they will never have to do the same. In addition to that phrase, he was good at phrase making, a good writer, Wilson. He had others, which you may remember, to make the world safe for democracy. That was the key. It would be, he stood for a peace of reconciliation, a peace without victors. All of these are Wilsonian talking points, and issued in his statement for peace, his characteristics of a peace, in his 14 points, which we won't go into. That's a test question, in which, as America got into the war, absolutely none of the other belligerents had the least interest. They all wanted to win. The German Empire, the Brits, the French. The Brits and the French were about at the end of their rope. That surprised the Wilson administration. I mean, at the end of the rope, especially financially. They were the economic superpowers of the time. And when we got into the war, they disclosed they were just about bankrupt. And it's hard to say who was more shocked, the Americans at this disclosure or the British and the French at the relative ease with which the Americans began to write the huge checks to keep them in the war. But again, that's another topic. And so the war ended in November 1918. The Germans not exactly surrendered, but appealed for an armistice on the basis of the 14 points. That had seemed idealistic and a little silly to them a year later. But in October 1918, the tide beginning to turn, the 14 points looked better and better. So it's on that basis that the Germany surrendered. And it's on that basis that Wilson himself, in an extraordinary move, sailed with a huge staff to Paris in late 1918, early 1919, or I guess it's the latter, to personally take part in the International Peace Conference in Paris that would reshape the map of Europe and lead to Wilson hope to world peace. He was then Wilson, the most popular man and perhaps the most powerful in the world. Huge crowds in Paris, in London, in Rome, crowds that today you would be like rock stars, at a mega concert. He had tremendous political capital, but he was dealing in Europe with some really intractable problems relative to the peace, hard negotiations in which the Germans were excluded for a reason, I would say. And so the peace, when it came out, wasn't really what he had hoped for by any means. With the one exception, he got his heart's desire, because the others thought this was meaningless, an international legislative body called the League of Nations, which issued in the United Nations today. Wilson was confident that whatever deficiencies were in the various treaties that concluded the war, they could be put right by the League itself. The League would superintend the peace, iron out differences, negotiate the conflicts in the future. Unfortunately, the United States rejected Wilson's League, rejected his treaties. We were never members of it. How big a difference that made could be debated. So Wilson more or less failed, even though he stood for something in Paris at the various negotiations. So he left office, deeply still, campaigning in America for the peace. He suffered a massive stroke, came back to Washington, was semi-paralyzed and nearly mute. Mrs. Wilson ran the country. That's no exaggeration. Gradually regathered his strength, but left office a broken man and deeply disappointed. He could have one consolation. In 1920, he won the then new Nobel Peace Prize, one of only 3 American presidents to do so. The other 2 are Theodore Roosevelt, who arguably did not deserve it. He had a case could be made, but he was a belligerent, militaristic kind of fella, seemed to enjoy war. So whatever that would weigh, and Barack Obama is the other. And I think he himself got it in his first year of office, and I believe he himself said that he had done yet nothing to deserve it. But Wilson's Peace Prize was, I think, very well deserved. Anyway, we come now to my favorite president. I feel a personal affinity with him, Franklin Roosevelt, whom you'll all remember. Well, maybe some of you are a little younger than I am, and you may not remember Franklin Roosevelt. We'll review him only briefly also. Born in 1882 into an upper scale New York family, wealthy without being super rich by any means. Went to Harvard, a rather indifferent student, but he was editor of the famous newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, which taught him people skills, how to get along. Went to Columbia Law School, didn't take a degree, like Wilson. Practiced a little bit of law in New York. Then he got interested in local politics, worked his way up to being a state representative, if I'm not mistaken. Admired Woodrow Wilson, supported him ardently. And when Wilson swept into the presidency, Roosevelt came along with him to Washington, this time as Assistant to Secretary of State for the Navy. The real Secretary of the Navy, not of State. The real was, as I said earlier, a man named Josephus Daniels from North Carolina. He's probably unknown to you. Only history majors or worse would know it. Remember we used to call coffee a cup of Joe? That's from Josephus Daniels. It's because in running the Navy, he was a strict prohibitionist, a strict teetotaler, and he abolished booze, which the Navy kind of liked from its ships, but he provided for unlimited cups of coffee as a substitute, hence a cup of Joe. Franklin Roosevelt did a lot of the work for the Navy, which grew into a significant force in wartime. It was later said that Roosevelt, when he became president in the elected 32, he had no particular qualifications for the job. He was governor of New York, but that didn't involve a whole lot of stuff. More recently, we've said, no, the opposite is true. This assistant secretaryship taught him a lot, not only about the Navy, but how to handle financial negotiations, how to get along with the Congress. It was really very good on-the-job training. And the same might be said for New York. It was here, whilst he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that my grandfather met him. And that's what Dave mentioned that in his blurb. The background is this. Grandfather was a Baptist minister in North Carolina, and he knew Josephus Daniels from some capacity or another, I know not what. And in 1920, being in Washington, and again, I know not why, he decided to stop by the executive building and to pay a call on his friend Josephus. Now, this sounds a little odd. No appointment, no notice, just knock on the door and come in. But that's 19th, early 20th century sociability. Didn't seem odd at all. You could, even in Lincoln's time and later, if you were in town and wanted to see Lincoln during the Civil War, he didn't have meetings or something going on, you might well get in to see him. Lincoln thought it was his job. You're an American citizen. He's president. You have a right to talk to him. And that sociability lasted for a while. I don't think you could knock on Wilson's door and get to see him, but grandfather had every expectation of conversing with Josephus. But Josephus was out. Would Mr. Hurt, Reverend Hurt, the secretary, asked, like to see the assistant secretary? Why not? And so he was ushered down to Franklin Roosevelt's office as a perfect stranger, and they talked, according to family lore, all afternoon. And I believe it, because grandfather was a big talker, and so was Franklin Roosevelt. And grandfather came home back to either Durham or Wilmington, North Carolina, utterly smitten, announced to the family that he had met a future president of the United States, and he would be a great president, right, on both counts. Oh, by the way, back to Siena College, it rates Franklin as either number one or number two among the ranking of presidents for, I think, for the whole time it's been doing this poll. If it's not Franklin as number one, it's George Washington anyway, the irony is that in 1932, when Roosevelt, and they exchanged correspondence. My grandfather and Franklin Roosevelt in 1920 and a little later. Grandfather wanted Roosevelt to come down to North Carolina and speak, and he'd be a front man. And Roosevelt said, well, maybe, but it never worked out. But then in 1932, when Roosevelt did run for office, grandfather refused to vote for him. I think it was a prohibition. You can guess which side my grandfather was on, and Roosevelt on the other. So they had a bit of a spat, but still there's that by way of background, which I could not prevent myself from talking about. As you know, soon after the war, in the early 20s, Franklin Roosevelt came down with adult onset polio. At least that was the standard diagnosis, and has been until fairly recently, when others have suggested, and Dave Goodell goes along with this, though of course it's an hypothesis we can't tell, may not have been polio, but a neurological syndrome called Guillain-Barré disease, identified by a couple of French medical scientists, autoimmune disease. Anyway, it struck Franklin severely and seemed to put an end to his political career. At first, it seemed he'd be paralyzed from his neck down, but he remained, upper body got well, but lower body never did. He never walked again. And that was serious business in the early 20th century. It made him handicapped or a cripple, which was not then intended as an insult, and therefore no political future. Americans like, big, tough, vigorous guys, usually. But Franklin fought the disease with great moral courage and physical courage too. He did heavy therapies, a workout regime to strengthen his upper body. Went to Warm Springs, Georgia, for the Warm Springs, hoping that would be curative. I've been to the Franklin Roosevelt Museum there at Warm Springs a couple of times. We used to go down from Atlanta. Maybe you've seen it too, but much more recently than I. I remember his wheelchair and the special car he had made for himself, which he could drive with using his hands, special handles, or that sort of thing. I asked my mother about his disease. Somehow we knew he was in a wheelchair for the entire presidency. And she kind of misrepresented the situation to me, as did, she's not the only one, many others. The American people never really knew the extent of Roosevelt's disability. He could walk after a fashion, and this is what my mother told me misleadingly, by using steel braces. These are really tough. I didn't understand that at the time. You strap them on, clamp them together, and they don't. And what they do is to stiffen your leg so that the leg doesn't collapse underneath you. And then you don't so much as walk, really, as kind of lurch from left to right, left to right to a left, lurching something like, I don't mean this disrespectfully, of Frankenstein's monster. Sometimes you see Roosevelt in pictures and photos. Usually he's sitting down in an open car or at his desk or wherever. Or if he's standing up, he's propped up against a fence or something or other, or a railing. But every now and then, particularly earlier, he really did have to walk a short distance or by himself. And that was chancy, but he managed it. And if you see him walking in the presidency, he'll usually have his hand clamped onto somebody's forearm. Maybe it's one of his sons. They were big, strong guys like Franklin. And Roosevelt is jauntily waving, smiling. Isn't this fun? Walking along using these braces. But there's one photo in particular from a Secret Service guy, a big man himself, and Roosevelt's hand is clapped right onto his forearm. And this guy is hurting because Roosevelt had a powerful grip. He's not having a bit of fun. I sympathize with him. So Roosevelt got into politics, back into politics even so. Well, he ran for vice president in 1920. So he was already a national figure, and got the Democratic nomination in 1932. And because of the Depression, won rather handily. And then won again in 1936, overwhelmingly. still won in 1940, though with a decreasing majority, and won again in 1944. 4 terms, as you know, the only president ever to have done that or ever will do that as long as the Constitution stays amended to prevent it. Like Wilson, Roosevelt swept in as a domestic reformer. His New Deal is evaluated differently, arguably controversially. It really did not cure the Depression. The Depression lasted throughout the 30s. The Depression perhaps got better. It plateaued, a little bit of growth here, a little bit more there. Then in 37, 38, a sharp contraction. You might have called it another depression, but they invented the word recession in those years, 37, 38. So that's how come we have recessions nowadays and not depressions. I won't go through his New Deal innovations or reforms, some of which were aborted by the courts, but one, as you probably already know, was the Social Security, for which we're still indebted to him, even if it's not quite properly funded. But that's, again, another letter to the editor. Again, Roosevelt didn't want to be a wartime president. But just like Churchill, he knew what Hitler was from the very beginning. And they came into power, Hitler and Roosevelt, in the same year, within a couple of months of each other. Hitler in January 33, Roosevelt in March of 33. But certainly Roosevelt never thought of getting into another war. As the 30s wore on, the international scene darkened. And then came the war starting out in the German attack upon Poland, the British and French joining into the war. And then with the fall of France in 1940 was a shock, not only to Roosevelt, Churchill, but to the whole country, including my grandfather, but we won't get back onto that. We don't really know what Roosevelt thought about American involvement in the war. He never told anyone how he felt. He didn't have a close confidant. He didn't keep a diary. He might have told a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen people different things. You might come away having spoken to Roosevelt thinking that he's on your side. He's anti-war, he's pro-war, he's somewhere in between, but none of that means anything. He really kept his own counsel. He vacillated in the run-up to the war. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe 1 step forward, 2 steps back. You know the name George Marshall. He was then Chief of Staff, U.S. Army, and the leading figure in the American conduct of the war, later Secretary of State. I believe he himself won a Nobel Prize, yes, architect of the Marshall Plan. Marshall said somewhere that before Pearl Harbor, he and other high military figures knew very well the United States would be getting into the war. At least they thought so. They thought there was no chance that we would avoid it. And he worried that Roosevelt would be able to lead. Wilson at least left the war to the professionals. But what would Roosevelt do because of this vacillation? And then came Pearl Harbor. And suddenly Roosevelt was a changed man. Marshall was amazed. Crisp decisions immediately. No committee this or cabinet that. Good decisions, strategic decisions, decisions about personnel. Nothing is ever perfect, so there are things to criticize, but when one needed to get things right, Roosevelt usually got them right. And he was, as these remarks would suggest, very much a hands-on president with the conduct of the war. So what were some of the things that he did in a general sense? The first, perhaps the most important, was that right away he set the strategy for America that Europe would come first, Germany would come first. The great majority of Americans wanted to go fight the Japanese. They had attacked us at Pearl Harbor. What had Germany done to us? Well, the short answer there is that Germany declared war on us on December 11th, but let that pass. The reality was that Germany, as a major industrial power, with the technology to develop the atomic bomb, Germany had leading physicists. Germany was by far the more dangerous foe. So that was Churchill's heart's desire to get the Americans on board for Germany, and he had no trouble. Roosevelt was already there. Churchill came over right after Pearl Harbor with an entourage, spent Christmas in the White House, quite an uproar. Churchill, high energetic, stayed up all night working, which Roosevelt didn't. Well, they got along well, Churchill and Roosevelt at the beginning, and personal relations cooled off somewhat later in the war. But meanwhile, 1942 was a tough year for Britain, with the losses continuing in Asia, in the Middle East. Roosevelt buoyed up Churchill's spirits. He wasn't invulnerable, Churchill, and Roosevelt, never a word of reproach from Franklin Roosevelt, always words of encouragement. And when it became clear soon after Pearl Harbor that Britain would not be able to protect Australia, Roosevelt made another decision and stepped right in to guarantee, as it were, Australia's defense. The Australians have never forgotten, unless they've forgotten today, which I don't know that they have, but you can't expect gratitude to last forever. Roosevelt correctly embraced Operation Torch, which was the British-American invasion of North Africa in late 1942. D-Day, Operation Overlord, was controversial, especially with Churchill. All-out assault on a hostile shore over water, but Roosevelt backed it firmly and never wavered there either. And he kept his nerve, Churchill did, during the Battle of the Bulge some months later, when others, not necessarily Churchill, began to have grave concerns that maybe we would find a way to lose the war after all. Roosevelt was also very good with personnel decisions. So George Marshall, he kept, embraced, and backed fully. And even, you may or may not know this, Marshall, is being chief of staff of the Army, is not in professional terms nearly as good as leading an army in battle. And Marshall expected to leave his Washington job and go over to England and command Operation Torch, to take command of the British-American forces, Allied forces that would be invading Europe. But Roosevelt let him down gently and told him that, well, Roosevelt, wouldn't be able to sleep at night if Marshall were out of Washington, which Marshall accepted with good grace. And I think that was the right decision to make, because Marshall played an invaluable contribution. And among other personnel appointments, Roosevelt signed off on Dwight Eisenhower to command Operation Overlord. It's generally agreed that no one else but Eisenhower could have done that kind of job, to have gotten inter-allied cooperation of the way he did. And the final thing I'll mention is that the British and Americans fought this war not just side by side, but as though they were in the same room. What you were be accustomed to with allies, even close allies, and we had not been particularly close in World War I. The British and Americans didn't get along all that well. Roosevelt had met Churchill just after the war, and Churchill had kind of snubbed him, but which I'm sure Roosevelt remembered always. Churchill, for all he could rack his brain, never. But anyway, the decision on the part of Roosevelt and others was they would fight this with the supreme coordination. That is, at the upper levels, the staffs would be combined. The staffs that fought Operation Overlord, planned and fought, were British-American staffs, with a British officer here, an American officer there, maybe side by side, one desk next to the other, so to speak. An unusual, unprecedented arrangement, but it worked beautifully. And Roosevelt can be praised for backing that. He died, Roosevelt did, late in the war, in April 1945. I remember being personally shocked by that news as it came on the radio. And as they say, the whole country mourned. He's buried up at Hyde Park, perhaps at his the Roosevelt home. The site is well worth a voyage well worth a pilgrimage, at least in my opinion. So as I feel very warm towards Roosevelt. I may not agree with all of his policies, but I believe he deserves his number one, number two ranking. I hope he keeps it and that the new cultural criteria don't somehow detract from his reputation. Oh, he didn't. He could not get high marks on desegregation, though he made tiny steps here and there. But if you want to find a drawback, he utterly depended upon what was then the solid South, the highly segregated Democratic South, and feared to take steps that Eleanor urged him to do to ameliorate this or that condition for African Americans. But he did some things, unlike Wilson. Which brings us to our third exhibit, Dwight Eisenhower, born 1890, died 1969. No, my grandfather never met Dwight Eisenhower. I feel that I have a kind of personal relationship with him. And when he ran for president the first time in 1952, I was 14, and I was a huge Eisenhower supporter. And this was in a Democratic state, remember. I had Eisenhower stickers, Eisenhower buttons, even an Eisenhower license plate that my father refused to mount on the family car. He allowed me to nail it up in the garage out of sight. But anyway, I was thrilled when he got elected. Flash forward to 1956 when he ran for re-election, and I was 18. In Georgia, you could vote at 18 in 1956. I think we were one of only two states that permitted early voting, so to speak. By then, I'd kind of fallen out of love with Eisenhower. He no longer met my criteria. And so I did a write-in vote for the mayor of Atlanta, Hartsfield, for whom the airport is named, proving in my own behavior that 18 really is too young to vote. I should never have been allowed anywhere near the ballot box. How I've regretted that vote ever since, and nothing obviously I can do about it except to talk favorably about Eisenhower. He was born in Texas, grew up in Kansas, into a rather poor family. The Eisenhowers never had a nickel to rub together. They were all a big family. I think it was a family of 4 boys, or was it 5? All the Eisenhower, oh yes, 4 boys, 1 sister, if I'm not mistaken. All the Eisenhower boys did well. One a successful lawyer in Seattle. Another, Milton Eisenhower, launched a career in higher education. He was president at Hopkins. A third, I forget the man's name, a successful journalist in the Middle West. And then there was Dwight, who went to West Point to get a college education. All the boys saw education as the key to escaping their lower class origins, if not poverty. Eisenhower intended to go to West Point to get to graduate and serve in the Army only long enough to serve out his obligation and then to launch a real career. There's the telephone. I'll have to just stop that. Okay, we'll hope that helped. But as it turned out, he enjoyed the Army, had a kind of a knack for it. It riled him that he didn't get into World War I. Had no, in fact, he never had any combat duty. He spent the whole war in America running a tank school near Gettysburg, inventing the tank school. Stayed on in the Army, slow progress through the interwar periods with low pay. But the Eisenhowers stuck it out. And then, of course, rapid promotion when the war came. George Marshall had his eye on Dwight Eisenhower, brought him to Washington, backed him steadily as he rose through the ranks, backed him for Operation Overlord. Others have criticized Eisenhower's military gifts, particularly the British. But recently, a well-known military historian has written a strong defense of him. And I don't think we need to go into that, yeah, but Eisenhower certainly won the war or helped win the war. So how can you quarrel with success? 2 things about Eisenhower's war that I would bring to attention. And one is that he wrote out a statement just on the eve of launching a D-Day. And this statement was, in case it was never read, the statement had to do in case the invasion failed. And it read something like this: the brave men who have fought and on Normandy Beach have met with a lack of success. Those are not his words. I have therefore ordered them to be withdrawn. I accept full responsibility, said Eisenhower, for any and all mistakes that have been made. In other words, he didn't blame weather conditions or any number of things, the unexpected germ. I take responsibility. Responsibility is mine alone. That's almost a direct quote. I think you'll see statements like that. Maybe not since then, and certainly not today. How many politicians, whatever, issue, non-apologies? I'm sorry I did it. It's really not all my fault. Eisenhower was different. Oh, something else I forgot to mention. In 1941, when the Philippines fell, Eisenhower had served under General MacArthur in the Philippines. The president of the Philippines, who evacuated and lived to fight another day, which he was right to do, began spreading money around to American officers to encourage them to liberate the Philippines early. MacArthur took the money, as did some others. I think the Philippines gave MacArthur $500,000, a lot of money in 1941, as you know. Eisenhower was offered $100,000. He didn't take a dime, not a brass farthing. So there's that to his credit. And the third item about the war, which I will instance, is the Battle of the Bulge, which was the terrible, the unexpected, tremendous intelligence failure here, a German counterattack in December of 1944, with the aim of splitting the British and American allies, driving to the coast, almost like what they'd done to France back in 1940, and stymieing the British-American onslaught into Germany. At first, it seemed just like a pinprick attack, but Eisenhower briefed, looked at the tactical map as the positions were being moved around, and he said, this is no local attack. He said right away, and immediately launched divisions to the appropriate places, moving ahead of his staff and ahead of everyone else. Eisenhower did not lose his nerve in the Battle of the Bulge either, although some might have. He looked shaken, but still resolute, and kept everybody's spirits up until the final victory. So I think his war speaks well for him. His book on the subject, Crusade in Europe, is not eloquently written. It's his personal memoir, not eloquently written, but it's well written and is worth a read. I have my father's copy. I'm glad that he was interested enough to acquire it. He became president in 1952. That was the election. Didn't know whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. The Democrats, who became his enemies, wanted him to run for them. But he decided he was a Republican. He was always a moderate Republican. I doubt that he would have gotten any Republican nomination today. But it was swept in overwhelmingly in 1953 and in 1952, and again in 1956, my ridiculous vote notwithstanding. His domestic record can certainly be defended. He gave us the interstate highway system, something that's wicked today because we drive too much. But I'll mention that he had a strong commitment to enforcing desegregation in the armed forces. Now, that credit for that goes to Harry Truman, as you know. But Eisenhower, if he'd emulated Wilson, could have pulled back, but he didn't. I served in Eisenhower's army, even if only as a ROTC, a summer cadet, and I saw and then later for a regular service. But yes, the Army was the most, and no doubt the Navy, the most integrated institution in the United States. And Eisenhower I don't think he gets credit for it, but he deserves the credit for it, certainly in my opinion. And he endorsed 2 civil rights acts that passed in his administration, those of 1957 and 1960, they're considered weakling acts today. And certainly they didn't go very far, the Democrats being in control of the Senate. But they were the first civil rights acts since the Reconstruction, and one should remember that. And then there's the episode of Little Rock, Arkansas. You may remember this, where Governor Orville Pavas almost literally stood in the schoolhouse door to block the enforcement of a court order admitting a young black woman to the Little Rock High School. Eisenhower, I don't think he wanted to do this really. He was content with a more moderate approach to desegregation. But once this had happened, he couldn't stand for that sort of, call it insurrection, insubordination on the part of Governor Phoebus. So he mobilized the Arkansas National Guard, which Phoebus had probably expected, but then he did something else, which Southerners certainly appreciated, because I was, there in Atlanta then. He sent units of the 101st Division up at Lexington, Kentucky, down to Little Rock to be sure that the enforcement orders went forward. Now, the 101st, which Eisenhower well knew, he had decorated the whole division for its valor in the Battle of the Bulge and before. The South, being a little bit more militarized than other parts of the country, knew what the 101 was also, and that got attention that it wasn't just the National Guard or a bunch of reservists. It was the 101 who came down. But time is catching us. Let's move on to his foreign policy, wartime, as it were, service. And here there's not too much that I'm going to say, except in general terms. The Cold War was at its height in Eisenhower's administration in 1953 to 1961. And he managed the Cold War successfully. But we did not get blown up, and we didn't blow anybody else up either. A couple of years after he left the presidency, someone observed to Eisenhower how fortunate we were that the Cold War didn't become a nuclear shooting war. That's not well known, because Eisenhower always had this wonderful smile when you saw him in public, seemed like a heck of a nice guy. It's not well known that Eisenhower had a bit of a temper. And that provoked his temper at a small level. And he turned right around to the person, whoever it was, and said, that wasn't luck, meaning I did it, or I and my staff, we did it, and we did it well. Oh, we shouldn't forget that the French met defeat in what was then Indochina during Eisenhower's early administration. And some of his advisors came to him with the recommendation that Americans get into what we would call Vietnam, then and there. This would have been in 54 or 55, an earlier Vietnam War than we really had. And Eisenhower said no. And sometimes saying no is even a lot better than saying yes. No Americans fought in Vietnam during his administration, to say the least. I'll conclude with this. When I left college in 1960, everybody, I think all over the colleges, particularly the faculty, and me too, not having gained in intelligence since 1956, we all thought Eisenhower was past it. He seemed like a doddering old man, nice guy, like your grandfather, but not really up to the job. And we based this on his performances in public at press conferences, where he would seem to stumble, fumble for words, couldn't put sentences together, forget paragraphs. So we were so glad, at least I was, and many others, when Kennedy got in, he could speak crisply, eloquently. Even his press conferences were a joy. So that seemed to be that. Eisenhower, speaking of those Siena rankings, sank to the bottom, or near the bottom, I'm sure. In 2010, he ranked 20th, which was coming up. In 2018. He ranked 6th, which is where I'd like to see him stick. I don't know. A tremendous growth. But what happened was that his biographers, who came later, began to study the subject, not from a political point of view, but from what actually happened, and enhanced his reputation tremendously. I saw the beginnings of this, I thought, in 1969. That was the year he died. And CBS News reran an interview that Walter Cronkite, you remember Cronkite, he'd been a war correspondent in Europe in the war, knew Eisenhower personally. And Walter Cronkite interviewed Eisenhower in 44 on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of D-Day. And there they were walking the beaches with Omaha Beach, the ferocious Omaha Beach just above them, talking back and forth. Future presidents would visit Omaha Beach, choreograph. Clinton, particularly shameless. Reagan, probably not a little opportunistic also, but Eisenhower, no notes. Just Eisenhower and Cronkite talking. Eisenhower had a photographic memory. I've read this. He really did have a very good memory. He was no dope. Pointing up to the heights of Omaha, recalled the names of the German units. Oh yes, the 351st was there, the so-and-so was that. Here was this draw that was critical, this gully, machine guns here, the destroyers out over there shelling the place. And I said to myself, there in 1961, 1969, I hadn't been able to see it in 64. I've underestimated Eisenhower. He was no dope. We were all wrong in 1960. He was the one who was right. So I'll leave there, not that he was perfect, but then who is? So I believe I've taken my time and a little bit more, but I got to do more justice to Eisenhower than I'd expected. So I'm, like Eisenhower, I'm unapologetic. It's my fault. So I'll open up for questions or comments, if any.
Hi, John. This is Nick.
Yeah, I can see everybody now. My wife fixed it.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, we're all here. Wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to tell you a story. As you know, I went to Williams, and I was in an honors program with James McGregor Burns.
Oh, yes.
And
I read
Burns
his
wrote,
book.
right, Burns wrote many books about Roosevelt. The two most famous is Roosevelt, the Lion and the Fox.
Yes. Pulitzer Prize, I think.
Yes, which took off on the Irving Berlin poem. And the other one was Roosevelt, the Soldier of Freedom. Jim Burns told me this story, and he certainly believed what he told me, but he claimed that Roosevelt knew 2 days before that Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed. And he made a decision that given the country was such in an isolationist mood, and given the fact that we had so many German and Italian immigrants, which were still supportive of their homeland, that he needed something dramatic to allow the United States to really get into that war. And of course, he had, as you had said, a lot of pressure from Churchill, and Churchill came and spent Christmas with him. And Jim's point was that he did misassess at how much damage the Japanese would do by shooting up the fleet in the Pacific, and he hadn't realized how close the ships and things were to each other, but that he had actually made that decision to allow the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor, not expecting it to cause them as much damage as it did, but basically to be the big motivator that he needed to get the Americans into the war.
I don't think that's accepted today. I'd have to go back and check. I left my big Pearl Harbor book behind. I forgot who's the man's name who wrote it. I think it's that they apprehended Japanese military activities somewhere, but not at Pearl Harbor specifically. No, wait a minute. I'm getting a little. They did issue a war warning to Pearl Harbor before it happened, but they didn't give it such high priority. Maybe you're more right than I'm thinking. I think that can be overstated, but I don't think they actually anticipated certainly not the massive attack that was about to happen. So let me just be an agnostic on that one. I'd have to go back and
yeah, well, while you're being an agnostic on it, one thing also to consider is that Day of Infamy speech.
Yes.
Burns claimed to be consulted about it a day or two before Pearl Harbor.
My word. Well, that is news. I would.
So, and so that speech was well prepared and was again meant to be a motivator to get the United States clearly into the war.
All right. Well, I can't deny that. That doesn't square with anything that I've read. But again, I'm not an expert in these fields. Oh, I should have mentioned, I meant that Eisenhower, did you know this? This is more than a factoid, was president of Columbia University.
Yes.
That was 48 to 53. So he and Wilson were the two university presidents during the period under consideration. And James Garfield, back in the 19th century, was also president of a small college, in Ohio. But unless, what was it, Dave Walters? Is he still here? Was it the Buchanan, who might have been president at Franklin Pierce or F&M? Well, anyway, we'll leave that. Any other questions or observations?
Dan, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Great talk. Two issues. One, and I'd open this up to the floor as someone who's got walking difficulties. How much were you all aware of Roosevelt's walking situation or not being able to walk or well? And do you think it affected people's view of him? Point one. And John, I'd like your opinion. This is kind of a broad question, but compare Roosevelt, New Deal times and so on, and look at us now with, I saw yesterday a $3 trillion suggested package in terms of infrastructure. The fact that money is being, and it has to be thrown at issues such as the pandemic, healthcare issues, and so on. The situation we're in now versus the situation that Roosevelt was in. Any connections? What do you think? And then the progressive, you mentioned the word progressive. That was a term that came up again now. It piqued my interest, the comparisons.
Yes, very much so. On the first question, that's easy to answer. I think Roosevelt's disability was soft pedaled. I know it was in the 30s and 40s, and the press helped keep the secret in a way that they would never have done today. Yes, we all knew he was in a wheelchair, but as my mother told me, it was as though he could walk around if he really wanted to. And whenever, I think that's the best answer I can give you. Just nobody dwelled on it once he'd gotten elected. I was so glad to get rid of Herbert Hoover. I guess that had a lot to do with it. And I think we just didn't realize we didn't realize that he had to literally be, if he wanted to get into a car, they'd have to lift him up and, and put him in. And he'd have to have an attendant to take care of him, help him get dressed in the morning and in the night. And at nighttime, the extent of it, we knew he was in a wheelchair. That's undeniable. But all the pictures, newsreels and others, were again, he's in his car waving and having a great time, or in some other position, where you don't draw attention to the wheelchair. But given his popularity, no one much seemed to mind. I don't know whether to compare the New Deal with the current progressive thing, but certainly Roosevelt campaigned on maintaining a balanced budget, which of course he did not do. And he got criticized, as Mr. Biden will presumably be criticized, for throwing money at problems, though not nearly so much money as is now under discussion. This is everything evolves. Progressives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, no longer today what they were yesterday. I mean, Biden and the others are probably way in advance of Franklin Roosevelt, but he was their predecessor. Dwight Eisenhower couldn't possibly get the Republican nomination today, could he? At least I don't think so. And maybe not Ronald Reagan either. I mean, that's kind of babbling, but I think that's about the best I can do.
Good babble.
Oh.
Hey, John, I have a question for you. You remember in the movie Patton, they made a lot about the relationship that Eisenhower had with Bradley and Patton, and
Yes.
Bradley trying to control Patton and all that sort of thing. What was the relationship with Eisenhower with his generals at that time? And do you have any insights about his feelings about Patton?
Well, I just know that what's on the record, Eisenhower supported Patton as much as he could. They had been friends after the war and agreed a lot on about tanks. They found each other's company very refreshing. When Eisenhower went to whatever it is, a command, a general staff school, it's kind of like the graduate PhD program for serving military. Patton gave
War college,
Eisenhower,
War college.
what is it? Yes, that's
The
it,
War
right.
college.
Patton gave Eisenhower his own notes to help him through. And Eisenhower did extremely well, as Patton had done extremely well. I think Eisenhower tried to give his generals as much freedom of action as he could, but he didn't intervene too much at that level. If you were if you were commanding a division in World War II in Europe, you worked for Bradley, and Bradley would decide if you had to be relieved or somebody else had, and Eisenhower would back you there. Eisenhower certainly backed Bradley, and he backed Patton for as long as he could, but they finally broke up. I think Eisenhower in the end just had enough of Patton's antics, and so, as you know, relieved Patton of duty there after the end of the war, and not too long before Patton suffered a fatal automobile accident. And Eisenhower did not choose to, he was in the US at that time, did not choose to fly over to attend Patton's funeral, which he probably should have done. That was probably bad manners on his part, but he just had enough of Patton.
Knowing Eisenhower, he probably wasn't too happy about the soldier being slapped.
No, he wasn't. I think that's exactly right. And, the movie was made with a very heavy input from Omar Bradley. He was their chief technical advisor. So if it's favorable to Bradley, it's not an accident.
Okay.
But I enjoy the movie. I'd watch it again. Yes.
John, could you comment on Eisenhower's relationship with Bernard Montgomery?
Oh, well, I can comment better on Montgomery's relationship with Eisenhower. Montgomery had a certain amount of contempt for Eisenhower, and he was one of the leading Eisenhower critics after the war. Montgomery always thought things would have gone better if he had been able to implement his own strategy. And I think not too long after, or maybe before the Bulge, he was almost insubordinate, and Eisenhower threatened to fire him. And after that, Montgomery sweetened up quite a bit. But I think Eisenhower didn't want to fire Montgomery, but he would have had to have had Churchill's blessing and George Marshall's blessing to do so. But he was capable of digging in his heels like that and threatening to resign, not threatening, but letting it be known that he would resign if he didn't get his way on something. I don't think they ever had a really close relationship after the war, but probably wasn't completely hostile. Yeah, Dave Goodell.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Barb and I visited the Eisenhower farm down by Gettysburg, and highly recommend that. His office there was, to me, the size of a closet as president. It just blew my mind, and how much he was into his prize bulls and steers.
Yes, I second the motion. Joyce and I have been there to the Eisenhower home, and it's impressive because it's not that impressive. It's obviously a upper middle class home, but it's nothing splendid about it, and the rooms are smallish, as you say, and the closets are smallish. I don't think you'd get very much for it if you put it on the market today. It hadn't been Eisenhower's house, but he built that just before he got elected president, used the royalties from his Crusade in Europe book. And so he didn't have, a ton of money, but yeah, I think that's a very impressive. Here was a person who didn't seem to have a tremendous ego about himself. He didn't have to have a Mar-a-Lago or something like that. Wouldn't have seen the point.
Yeah. Thank you. Great talk.
Okay, thank you all
Good.
very much.
Well
Appreciate it.
done, John.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. You're a great audience.
Thank you.